on the front end, or do you have an after the fact recovery mechanism on the back end? Of course, as I had mentioned earlier, there's a risk really where you have a transmission owner right to step in the shoes of the finance company of the developer and finance the project while being paid by the developer. You have a default risk that also has to be accounted for. Thank you.
Chair Nelson and then Chair Stanek.
So I'll say that I'm really hoping for good discussions around this, because I think these are actually solving a few different problems. You know, I think that the backbone voltage distribution and sharing of costs solves major regional problems, especially around reliability and congestion. And I think, but it's certainly solving it's a long-term solution, right? No one's building a backbone transmission system in, 2 to 3 years. I mean, that's like 5 to 7 years out. So those issues, I think, are good principles and good long-term things to think about. Both the proposal by NextEra and Enel, I think, are more based on short-term issues that they're seeing, which are how to get things that are in the queue now interconnected fairly from their perspective. And I think from our perspective, we shouldn't be tied to just accepting the proposal they have, but trying to figure out what is actually the fair way to do it. So I'm not necessarily sure they're mutually exclusive, and I think they should be looked at in two different ways. I do think that the issues we've seen in Massachusetts are primarily around a lot of solar or distributed generation. It's not just solar. It's a lot of distributed generation that's spread out over large geographic areas. And I'll joke, large for New England, all right? So anyone in ERCOT just giggled. I would say that for that reason alone, we're seeing that those are very unique things. It's not one generator trying to come in on one substation. But when we do a cluster study, you're dealing with the same size as one generator, but spread out geographically over miles and miles and miles, impacting lots of little upgrades on substations that are actually in aggregate then triggering transmission issues. So it's actually coming through the distribution and then hitting the transmission. Something like that, I think, needs a different framework. And could be, you could have a different tool in the tool belt. There's nothing that says that this is the principle forever, but it could almost set, like I think Ted Thomas has brought up several times the idea of metrics, and I think that making sure we have the right tool for the situation in our regions is probably appropriate, because there are distinctions, but I think being able to set up and frame what those would be that would be acceptable under FERC's framework and under a regional ISO's framework, I think is an important thing that we can do to make sure that we're using the right technique given the right situation that ultimately creates the most fair and economic framework for customers at the end of the day. Because I think that, load at the end of the day, you want the most economical outcome.
Chair Stanek, you were next.
I think to the extent that we're looking for something with relative simplicity and something with a framework that FERC is familiar with and has approved in the past, a voltage threshold would seem to make sense. I know the state commissioners have thoroughly reviewed the NL and NextEra proposals, which were distinct, but now they're a little bit closer together. And it's something that I could get comfortable with. I think Chair French laid out the pros and the cons. I think there would need to be some clustering layered on top of this instead of one-off projects. Additionally, I think we need a little more data. The Seventh Circuit did say that the benefits need only be roughly commensurate. And I think a voltage level threshold will get us there. But without more data, I'm a little concerned as to whether 365 or 500 kV is the right bright line to make these distinctions. Again, I can't overemphasize the appeal of simplicity. When looking at that proposal, you do have several tranches. They're all based on physics. They're all based on objective load flows. But if we could get the data to support that, I think that could go a long way to getting both state and federal commissioners comfortable to make sure that the right parties are paying the right amounts.
Right, so Chair Dutrell, I'm glad you raised your hand because I was going to circle back to you and Commissioner Christie and Duffley, having heard folks on this, whether that's something that is still consistent with the way you were thinking about continuing mainly participant funding. Yeah. And I don't know why you raised your hand, but I'll
Well,
go ahead.
I was going to say, I'm not sure I'm going to answer your question directly, but
Go ahead.
what I was going to say is with the conversation, and I've emphasized this before, I think it's important that we continue to have these discussions because we glean a lot of different information in it. And I agree with Chair Stanek when he said that, NARUC did not close the door, particularly, and neither did Pennsylvania. We made some recommendations within our comments. But I think of the MISO cost sharing mechanism, it is intriguing. It is easy to understand. I would make sure that we understood that the benefits were, you can quantify them and they're not speculative in nature. And I think I started out my comments with saying that consumers should be protected from any type of speculative, type of mechanism and things of that nature. So I will say that, and hopefully that answers your question. But another thing that I was going to say, and I'm thinking out loud, so I apologize for that right now. I'm thinking out loud because as we walked through all the different changes that we did in Pennsylvania when we went to moving away from the vertically integrated market and going into retail competition, there was that big discussion. And at that time, I was working for the General Assembly in terms of stranded costs and the concerns there. And when you're looking at the changes here, I'm also hoping that we are getting a better understanding of whether there would be some type of stranded cost that we might have to deal with, or some type of discrimination between the generators that had to pay the load, and then if you're changing participant funding with, they would have to compete with the new generators coming online. It did not have to pay the entire cost. So I just throw that out there. Hopefully that answers part of your question, Dr. Rob, and then also gives some follow-up to what others were saying.
Thank you. Chair Scripps.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Rob. I guess in the spirit of thinking out loud, I keep coming back to what we're trying to get here, and what is it that we need to see from the grid, and then how those costs are being allocated. And it strikes me that in cases where FERC is confident that the necessary long-range grid planning is taking place, that we have a system in place at the RTO level that sort of addresses how the system is changing and is building the backbone projects that are necessary to facilitate that change while maintaining system reliability, then perhaps participant funding is more legitimate, because the projects that then are being funded, the upgrades, are sort of additive to the backbone functions that we need and expect from the grid. But where FERC may be less confident that the long-range backbone projects are being developed, and so where the network upgrades that are taking place as a result of the generator interconnection process are in some ways the network upgrades that are needed for the proper functioning of the grid, then perhaps it's less legitimate. And it may not be all or nothing, but sort of sliding scale here, because more of the benefits of the upgrades in terms of maintaining overall system reliability are ultimately flowing to customers who are not being assessed costs or not being assessed their fair share of costs. So I realize that probably goes against everything around simplicity. But I do think it matters that if we have confidence that what is coming out of the RTO processes is actually getting to the core functions of the grid in terms of maintaining reliability, then it does seem that the interconnecting process is additive to that and should pay more of it. But if that's not the case, it does seem that we're on sort of less firm foundations in terms of whether the costs associated with the upgrades are being allocated in a roughly commensurate manner.
And is there also a transition issue regardless, that even if FERC and the RTOs are putting in place the kind of a better longer term planning process, there's still going to be a period before those backbone transmission projects are built in the new system, and you still have big queues right now?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some of what we're seeing, you know what, I'm not going to finish that given some open cases.
Okay.
I see Matt smiling.
Chair Thomas.
I agree very much with what Commissioner Scripps just said. And I will also agree with your suggestion, but then that is where it really gets complicated. When you want predictability, what you're talking about is a transition. Is that per project or on some other basis? But I think is the key point made was the right transmission plan is your shared cost. If you're doing it that right, there shouldn't be that many remaining shared costs. And that's a critical point. But as you say, if you're not yet doing it right, how do you make a transition? And if you have some formulaic approach that changes as your transmission system improves, then you have the uncertainty, by definition, uncertainty that would impair your project on the front end. Thank you.
So before we move on to the next two options, alternatives, if you will, just want to give anybody else who hasn't spoken and wants to weigh in or provide a different perspective or a nuanced view that we haven't heard yet on the participant load cost sharing. We have a little bit of time, so I just want to make sure that we've heard from everybody who wants to say something on this, including our FERC commissioners.
I'll take that bait again.
Okay, go ahead.
And the reason I was pausing is because it's been said, but to cut through, there's an important temporal element here in terms of if we lived in a world where we had perfect long-term regional planning and interregional planning, but relative to the NOPR, if that process existed today, participant funding would be dealing with a lesser set of expenditures, and that would make sense. Sorry, the coffee's getting made, and you know, costs would be commensurate with benefits, but that's not where we are today. And so for some period of time, we are navigating, interconnecting future low-cost supplies with and reliability and economics and via the interconnection process. And when you think about what happens, you know, the idea that customers in load don't want benefits isn't the way that I look at it. I look at it like one of the benefits of a significant network upgrade may be a deferred reliability investment that everybody is paying for. It is certainly the lower cost of electricity, wholesale electricity prices that are tempered by fuel-free resources as opposed to what is this week like $7 gas, right? So where's that benefit being captured? And yes, going forward in the world where we're already, the system's working more efficiently because we have that structured backbone, we don't need to worry about the fact that the people getting those benefits are avoiding payment for them. But right now, this kind of blunt tool of participant funding this unsophisticated blunt tool means that that is happening, right? And so what's the opportunity to do something more sophisticated, use a methodology that captures some of the concerns that Commissioner French was talking about in the details and Chair Nelson, but also finds a balance relative to simplicity. And I think there is an opportunity to do that somewhere in these threads of conversations that people have been raising today.
Thank you. Commissioner Christie, I saw your hand was up, and did you want to say something?
Yeah, I'll just make one point. Jonathan, am I on?
Your audio's on, but not your video.
Okay, well,
Go ahead.
yeah. Just want to make a couple points about, in non-RTOs, because we've heard a lot of rhetoric today about, the holistic planning again, and that would take care of everything. And, in non-RTOs, these states are largely IRP states, and that's exactly what you do in an IRP process. I mean, you look at all resources, you look at generation, you look at distribution, transmission, you do this all holistically, and costs are covered through either, largely rate-based generation or PPAs. But participant funding, we're talking specifically about RTOs, and Commissioner Dutrell made some very good points in her comments, and I just want to harken back to those. RTO markets were set up back in the early 2000s, and they were going to be the vehicle by which generation, which was coming out of rate base, because this is what restructuring was all about. Generation was going to come out of rate base, and it was going to compete in these RTO markets, energy capacity, if they have a capacity market. Not everybody has a capacity market, but the Eastern RTOs do, but certainly energy markets and ancillary services markets. But generation was going to come out of rate base where it was guaranteed revenue for things like interconnection costs, and it was going to compete. And it was going to compete in these RTO markets on the basis that the stockholders and the generation companies would bear the risk, and they would seek their revenues in these markets. And interconnection cost is just a cost of doing business. I mean, it's a but-for cost of doing business. So if you want to go back to integrated, holistic IRP planning for everybody, then that's a very different model than what these RTOs were set up in these RTO markets. And this is why let's not forget why the generators want to interconnect. They want to interconnect in these RTOs because they want to get into the RTO markets, because that's where the money is. And so that is exactly the way it was set up to operate. So I'll just make that point because I think Commissioner Dutrell made that point very, very astutely, and speaking from history as well and knowledge from Pennsylvania. It did it exactly this way. And so I think that's just important to keep in mind about why these RTOs markets were set up and what the interconnection costs were going to be borne by the generator, because it was the generator's way to get into the RTO markets and get the revenue available there. So anyway, I'll just make that point. Commissioner Dutrell made it very, very well. Commissioner Duffy did as well. And with that, I'll stop it there.
Great, thank you. So we're going to, Commissioner Duffy, go ahead.
That's okay. You can go forward. I was just going to make a follow-up point to Commissioner Christie about the markets and the difference between an RTO and a regulated market, because some could argue that in changing the participant funding, you're de-risking, you're shifting the risk, you're de-risking the investment, but when it comes to the returns, you're still in a full market versus regulating the amount of, the return. So I'll just make that final point.
Okay, so now we're going to look at where LO's responsible for 100% of the cost for certain types of upgrades, and talk about two in particular: the existing crediting policy in place in non-RTO ISOs, or load underwrite specific baseline upgrades that deliver benefits to load, if those can be clearly defined. And we were going to start with Chair Glick, and then Commissioner Rechtschaffen, and again, Commissioner Duffy.
Thanks, Dr. Rob. So to pick up on the discussion, I think it obviously plays right into what we were just talking about, is that I think it doesn't always, especially in RTOs, it doesn't necessarily make sense. If it doesn't make sense to provide, to require generators to pay 100%, it doesn't make sense to require load to pay 100%. Again, it's a simple standard. It's not always easy to figure it out, but again, costs have to be allocated roughly commensurate with benefits. And the fact is that in many cases, load benefits, but load doesn't benefit completely. We have to recognize generators also benefit and benefit significantly from some of these interconnection facilities. But I think it's not just that we're facilitating interconnection, which is a big part of it, but we're also talking about facilities, network upgrades that again provide significant benefits. In some cases, it depends on the particular upgrade, but in some cases provide significant benefits to load. And again, as the courts have told us, we have to make sure that the costs are allocated to beneficiaries. So I think just like it would be inappropriate to allocate 100% to one side, it's inappropriate to allocate 100% to the other side. But this notion here that somehow that this is part of the RTO compact, and therefore that we have to generators have to pay for the full cost regardless of benefits, again, ignores our statutory, I should say our statutory, our legal requirement as defined by the courts.
Commissioner Ruckschaffen?
Thank you. Well, I'm gonna give some comments that I think straddle both this particular sub-issue as well as some of the broader issues that we've been discussing this afternoon. And I think it's very important to keep in mind the point that a number of May Chair scripts started making it that upgrades keep getting larger and larger. They're increasingly providing system benefits, providing backbone services. And you, Dr. Rob, you started out with the first question: is 100% participation funding consistent with costs being commensurate with the full range of benefits provided? And my view is it's not. And I also think Chair Glick and Commissioner Phillips have raised salient points about whether or not this is consistent with the Seventh Circuit and other judicial rulings. What I wanted to talk about is an approach in the CAISO known as participant funding, which is a form of crediting. And I recognize this is not fully consistent with NARUC's general support for retaining participant funding and may not be consistent with some other Western states. I do think it's notable in NARUC in the NOPR said we shouldn't close the door on moving away from first to cost allocation. So there's some openness on NARUC's part, but admittedly not. There's a strong support for retaining many elements of participant funding. I think there's some lessons to be learned from an approach like CAISO that departs from the pure participant funding, and it can overcome some barriers for projects while still maintaining cost discipline. And it seemed to have worked well in the CAISO footprint. So as I mentioned, it's the participant financing approach is a variation of FERC's default crediting policy. Interconnection customers provide the initial financing to construct their facilities and upgrades. Once they go into commercial operation, the transmission owner reimburses them within 5 years. And then those costs are included in transmission rate base and recovered from ratepayers. So what it covers, the generator still covers the cost between the generation facility and the point of interconnection. The costs that are covered by this policy are the reliability substation and deliverability backbone upgrades. I think an important element of this, and Commissioner Phillips mentioned this, is there's a cap on what costs are reimbursable. And I think in CAISO's experience, no facility has exceeded that cap. And also only upgrades that are needed to meet resource adequacy requirements are reimbursable. So that ensures that we have the load that's charged for the upgrades are benefiting and adhering to the beneficiary pays principle that is so important. And the advantages that come from this approach, or could come from a approach like this, or that borrows some elements of it. Number one is there's price certainty. As I said, there are firm cost caps. You can avoid the cascading costs and restudies if customers earlier in the queue withdraw. We heard a lot of discussion this morning. We have heard from developers through this task force and others saying how much both the high cost and the uncertainty contributes to the cycle of project withdrawal. The CAISO says it rarely sees late withdrawals due to network financing issues. So that's one benefit. We've talked a lot in this task force and just in the immediate prior session about how to allocate the benefits among customers. By the way, I'm also supportive and interested in the MISO highway byways or approach like that for its simplicity. But if you're trying to come up with other alternative methods to apportion benefits among later on interconnection customers, this avoids that very complex allocation and accounting process. And it still does provide cost discipline. It still makes developers have skin in the game. They're still incentivized to site their projects with lower interconnection costs. They want to minimize financing costs. They want to do what Commissioner Christie said. They want to sell their projects to load-serving entities, so they want to make sure their projects are competitive. They want to get their projects online as quickly as possible. I know that Commissioner Duffley expressed a concern about this, this potentially leading to upgrades in areas that may not be desirable for a system as a whole. CAISO has not reported any seeing a lot of inefficient siting. It may be because many projects are location constrained, as Commissioner Phillips notes. I also think there are other ways we've talked about earlier today, such as cluster reform, including tying priority and projects to those approved in state processes and others that could try to address this larger question. And as I said, it helps overcome barriers to constructing desirable projects that are deterred by risk, uncertainty, and delay. And I do, just to conclude, I do recognize the strong support, as many of my colleagues have articulated here, for retaining participation funding. But I do want to underscore that this is a beneficiary. This is a beneficiary pays approach. I do think regional differences can and should be respected, but this is one sort of way of taking a crack at a very difficult set of problems.
Before we move on to Commissioner Duffley, I just have two clarifying questions. So, one was this is still really a cost sharing proposal, right? Because you were saying that the interconnecting generating customer was still paying for the cost up to the substation. Is that right? That's
correct.
Okay. So in some ways, this is a bit like the I think the next era proposal we were talking about before. Could you maybe just talk a little bit about the decision to have the interconnecting customer fund the substation backbone upgrades and then get paid back over 5 years, as opposed to just having the customers, TO customers, pay for it right away? What's the nexus of that?
I think that's an attempt to balance the concerns that there's not enough cost discipline, there's not enough skin in the game if the interconnection customers don't have to put some money down, they don't have to finance some of the costs. So it's a balance between those kind of consumer protections while recognizing that really these projects have much broader benefits and ultimately their costs should be socialized.
Got it. Okay. Commissioner Duffley.
Thank you. So before I start on my planned comments, I appreciate everyone's comments today, as I know we all do, in listening to each other. I especially appreciate Commissioner or Chair Glick's comments that he made prior, 2 speakers ago, I guess. And the only point that I'd like to make as to this subsection is that North Carolina and the Seabrook states want to remind everyone that transmission owners that are not part of an RTO or an ISO do not have this participant funding, except in North Carolina when it's PURPA projects, but rather the crediting policy applies. And so we would request that FERC take a look at this policy, because under certain circumstances, this policy can lead also to unjust and unreasonable rates. So we would suggest potentially that FERC could provide some guidance there, as well as potentially a mechanism to work through those situations without parties having to file a case at FERC when the participants, the active participants, all agree on how to resolve the situation. And I think potentially we'll talk about affected system cost as well, hopefully in a further discussion. Thank you for your time.
Great. So do we have some other comments, observations, just from what you just heard from Chair Glick and the 2 commissioners, and the California approach in particular? Is that helpful for those that were kind of like the participant load cost sharing, but we're still concerned about customers picking up too much? We're tiring you out. Okay. So then why don't we'll move on to the kind of the last option, which again is in some ways another way of doing participant funding, which was the generator subscription approach, where current and future generators pay for all or a certain percentage of upgrade costs, for instance, for renewables into upgrades into renewable rich areas. We have a couple of examples of that. And we were going to have Chair Stanek and Commissioner Christie talk about that.
Thanks, Dr. Rabb. I recognize we've made it to the final hour here, so I'll try to be brief. Obviously, the subscription model has been used by FERC in various ways over the years, of course, with respect to natural gas pipelines and the signing of precedent agreements, but also with respect to merchant transmission. Back in 2009, FERC, in 2 very important orders in both Chinook and Zephyr, allowed these merchant transmission providers to effectively find an anchor shipper or an anchor customer who would take at least typically half the capacity, and then allow subscriptions to be signed up for the balance of the capacity. Now that was merchant transmission, but there's no reason why a generator subscription approach could not work in terms of GI issues as well. And I think some of the benefits that could flow from this would be faster interconnection process, efficiency, and probably most important to this afternoon's conversation, making sure that the costs of this upgrade would be paid for in a fair and equitable manner. I would note that we did not see a wealth of comments in the ANOPR with respect to subscriptions. PJM did dedicate some time in its comments to suggesting whether or not a subscription approach would be something to be considered, but there wasn't a tremendous amount of details associated with PJM's proposal there. what is and what is not a subscription. A subscription would not necessarily require a generator or a developer to fully fund the enhancements. Rather similar to what was said in some of the ANOPR comments, the enhancements could be funded in part by customers if they benefit. So we get back to beneficiaries. And if they could determine that their benefits would effectively exceed the costs from the development of whatever transmission upgrade is placed on the system. Of course, we get back to the benefits would need to be quantified. They could not be speculative. And in many instances today, as we've seen from the NL and Nextera proposals, they could be quantified. And one example is that PJM recently completed an offshore wind study at the request of OPSI. And that study demonstrated that by building this additional offshore wind power and the enhancements to the system upgrades, most of the region would ultimately see lower costs. So there was a net benefit in the sort of benefit cost ratio. At the end of the day, a subscription model would need to assure that the generators pay their fair share. Customers, of course, based on what the studies say, would also have to be responsible for some of those costs. Again, it wasn't widely discussed in the NOPR, but FERC has a wealth of history with respect to these subscription models, and perhaps it's something we could further explore in this docket. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Christie?
Well, I think this is the classic example where the devil is in the details. And I'd have to see a specific proposal and just like Jerry Maguire, follow the money. Or that was show me the money, but same principle, follow the money was Watergate. But if the merchant developer is paying the cost of the transmission line, including the interconnection cost to the grid, and if the generators who want to interconnect to the merchant line are paying the cost or through some arrangement with the owner of the merchant line, then those costs are not being shifted onto consumers, which is a good thing. I think that would be a very good model to explore for people who want to build a 500-mile line into a remote area, along the Texas CREZ model. I think that the subscription and merchant development line is a developer model is probably one to look at, because the costs are borne by the developer. But again, the devil's in the details. And so to say this model is good, bad, or indifferent, it's all going to come down to what are the actual details. I think the potential is really great, particularly again for those who want to build 500-mile lines into remote areas to access wind in particular. This is potentially has got a lot of potential, but show me the money, show me who's paying, and the details. And that's always the most important question about anything, is let's see the details and who's paying what.
And Dr. Rav, I'd just like to respond, if I can, Commissioner Christie. I agree with him. Right now, no transmission developer is going to develop a line to the middle of nowhere without having some assurances that the generation is going to be there. Conversely, in a resource-rich area, they're not going to be building windmills or solar farms if there's no guarantee that there's going to be transmission out of that area. So each of these subscription models will definitely be cabined by whatever's in that contract, and it would be a contract. So we'd have to see what those terms are.
Well, and if it works that way, I think that'd be great. I mean, I think Chair Stanek is absolutely right. If no one's going to build a line without customers who are going to interconnect and pay transmission services fees, and vice versa. So I think, again, the potential is there, and I think it's a great, potentially a good model, for those who want to do like a Texas CREZ type line. But again, let's see the whole package and see who's paying what. And the potential is clearly there. I absolutely agree with that.
Chair Nelson.
And I actually have a question for Commissioner Christie, which is, we think often about the Texas model or building the 500-mile line. How do you think this model would work for something like offshore wind development? Do you think this would be an appropriate model for that type of project?
Well, we'd have to see a specific project. I mean, you know, I think I can talk about this. If I can't, Matt, make sure you jump in and say no. But we just approved New Jersey's offshore wind state agreement approach, which came, you know, with a certain set of details. And so I'm not going to, actually maybe in the 30-day rehearing, maybe, so I'm not going to go into detail. But I think it's a fact we approved it. I mean, that's on the record. And so you asked me specifically about offshore wind. You know, again, we would have, I'd have to see the actual, you know, the actual proposal and see how it's being proposed. I can tell you in Virginia, the offshore wind is going to be mostly rate-based or paid for through PPAs or rate basing. So there's no question about who pays. It's going to be paid by consumers because it's a vertically integrated state. And that was my point I made earlier about who pays interconnection costs. Well, if you're in a vertically integrated state, there's no question about who's going to pay it. Participant funding is only applicable in an RTO in the whole market construct that RTOs were set up with 15 years ago. But, you know, you make a good point. I mean, offshore wind could be the type of, I would call it a merchant project, you know, such as the lines through, you know, remote from load centers, remote from grid to pick up wind. Again, let's see the numbers and let's see what, you know, let's see who's paying what.
Well, I agree with you. We'd have to see the numbers, but the concept seems to apply well for that type of project based on what we know. Again, I could not agree with you more. We don't want to be paying for something that's non-economic. So
no, and if the merchant transmission developer has the subscribers, you know, has the generation developers that do want to be part of the whole package, I mean, that's they wouldn't move forward. I don't think anyone's going to do a build if they will come, you know, unless they get a federal grant from DOE to pay for the whole thing without any customers. But that's fine too, because consumers are not paying. So, and actually that could be part of the mix. I think DOE has money for exactly that purpose. That I think that has tremendous potential. The whole construct of the merchant transmission line paid for by the developer with a subscription model, some of which could be federal funding, all of which keeps the costs, you know, away from consumers. It's got tremendous potential.
Others want to jump in about how they feel subscription has promise? Is it a very niche approach to what we were wrestling with here, or does anybody have issues with it? Chair Thomas.
I think as you say, it's a niche. If you get everybody to agree, they're already singing Kumbaya. This allows people to do that. They already have their deal to do it. But then I think there's a broader problem that I'm not sure this solves. Thank you.
Well, can I just add that by definition, it's you know, not part of the planned grid. I mean, it's a merchant transmission line, so it is going to be a niche product by definition. It doesn't mean it can't be a positive thing for the specific purpose for which somebody wants to develop it.
Yes, I agree completely with that.
Right.
If they want to do it, we got to let them do it.
Well, if the states will let them cite it, there's another consideration, but it's not part of the planned grid.
Anybody else before we move on? Okay. Commissioner Allen, I think this is one you wanted to talk about. We had other here besides what we had pre-specified, and I think you volunteered to talk about another idea that I think you foreshadowed earlier today.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Rob. Yeah, this is a concept that I think of as kind of an overlay in the conversation about load pays versus participant pays. It's a framework that I think addresses some of the big thorny nuts that we're dealing with when we talk about free ridership, lumpy and large payments, cost uncertainty, some of the big things that we can't seem to kind of get around. And the concept broadly is to recognize that if we think about generators not as, you know, the next in queue, individual generators coming along and then taking essentially the entire increment of costs that they have caused on the system and assigning it back to them, whether we credit it later or not. But if we think of it as, you know, more like, you know, they're part of a class or a group of generators. So you can think in terms of a cluster of generators. And in New England, when we do a cluster and we assign the cost for the clusters, we then apportion the cost of, you know, a major kind of backbone or trunk investment to those interconnecting generators. That's, you know, we've essentially allocated that among all the generators in some, you know, pro rata fashion. But if you extend that kind of even further upstream, you think in terms of either superclusters or the backbone system, the 345 kV and up, there may be, you know, a portion of the joint and common network that is reasonably attributed to the needs, satisfying the needs of these participating interconnection customers. You can kind of fairly, on a, you know, benefits received basis, allocate a share of that common network to those interconnecting generators, and you don't have to do it as an initial upfront, you know, payment. You could actually do it and assign those costs on, you know, we talked, it was mentioned earlier briefly, a per megawatt fee or some other way of essentially assigning, you know, a share of the joint and common backbone network, whether it's, you know, 115 and above, or perhaps a different factor at 345 and above, but you can assign that to each interconnecting generator in a way that doesn't impose those costs just on the next generator in the queue coming forward. You can do it in a way that smooths those costs across, you know, everyone in the queue that is potentially going to contribute toward the cost of those generators, and you can kind of assign them back. And you can further kind of take a step further, as we do in Vermont. We create adjusters to our, you know, sub-transmission system and our distribution system to help, you know, steer the interconnecting generators toward areas that have more capacity. So if we built up the system to have more capacity in one area versus another, there might be an adjuster that essentially encourages them to locate in one place or another. So it checks a number of boxes, at least for me, in terms of getting around the problem, working our way past the kind of participant pays versus load pays, because this is relatively agnostic with respect to whether it's participant or load. It's just the fair allocation of benefits along the lines that Commissioner Phillips had talked about earlier. And it can be applied in a way that I believe can essentially steer generators toward the location, you know, cost causation areas that we want to steer them. If we built up the network more in one area than another, then we can kind of steer them back in another area through these adjusters. But it's, you know, it's you know, we're regulators, and this is what we do all the time. It's called rate design, but it's recognizing that we can kind of do what we do and know how to do well to, you know, create a solution path that is quite different than the kind of the linear or serial framework that we rely on for the direct assignment of cost to the next addition to, or the next in line in the queue. Thanks.
So any questions for Commissioner Allen, or any initial reactions to this approach? Chair Clark.
Well, more just an observation, but I think the proposal that Chair Allen just outlined would be very helpful when you, in terms of offshore wind, if you build a collector system. So I mean, that's probably the fairest way of allocating the cost. You have a bunch of different offshore wind farms all coming into a central point, and then before it goes on land. So I think it's something certainly worth exploring, at least with regard to that, and it might work in other examples as well.
Any other questions or comments on that approach? So I think we should just take a quick 5-minute break. We're right on schedule with that. And we've all been talking now for over 2 hours. Let's just take a 5-minute break, gather your thoughts. We're going to come back and kind of wrap up this conversation. Okay. Tanya, put this. Thank you. Welcome back, everybody. We're right on schedule. Tanya, if you could put your slides up again and just go to that last slide. Okay. So our last conversation before we go to the wrap up has to do with next steps, having the whole conversation that we had this afternoon. Are these challenges and potential solutions working themselves adequately on their own in each region of the country? And if not, what specifically do we need FERC in particular, the RTOs, states, and other stakeholders to do in order to either carry on with cost allocation the way it's been, or make some adjustments or changes? And we have to start us off, Chair French and Chair Thomas, and then for Commissioner Clements, and then we'd like to hear from as many of you as we can. Take it away, Chair French.
Thanks, I'll go ahead, and I'll be very brief on this one so we can move forward, but I'm probably parsing words here, but let me give an emphatic no that these issues are not working themselves out on their own. I do think the issues are working themselves out. The stakeholders, at least in the RTO regions, are working on these issues. I think SPP, MISO, PJM, perhaps others have all filed queue mitigation plans to try to work down their backlogs. And those incorporate, as far as I know, all of the principles that we talked about in the first part of the meeting today. And so I'm not sure the approval process on all of those, but they're all fairly recent. I think they need to be given time to work and see if we can help process the queues using those, although I think additional FERC encouragement would be helpful on that. I would also say, I don't know as much about the other regions, but for the Southwest Power Pool, I know I mentioned this earlier, we have a task force just created to consolidate all of our planning processes and try to plan more holistically. And that includes some specific recommendations to develop new cost sharing methods when a project meets multiple needs or benefits multiple stakeholders. It's exactly what we're talking about now of breaking down costs between generators, load, transmission customers. But I think I would recognize that is a long-term process. That's probably a 5 to 7 year process. And so, what do we need from FERC? I think we need them to encourage those processes that the RTOs are undertaken, not to push out rules that would somehow slow down those reforms, because those are big reforms and good reforms. But it's the same issue we've talked about all throughout the day today, that there's a temporal element to this, that there is unmet demand right now. And we probably can't just say this problem fixes itself in 7 years, or the parties are on it and it'll be fixed in 7 years. And so I think there is some element of needing some reform, but we need to make sure that it fits in with the reforms that that regions are already trying to undertake in the direction that the commission wants us to go anyway. So I don't have the silver bullet, but I think that's the balance that we're asking the commission to strike. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair Thomas.
I think there are areas where it is working itself out, and in those areas, flexibility is what is needed. But those, I think, that is more applicable to areas other than what we're talking about today. To me, the place where it isn't working itself out is the nexus between interconnection and long-range transmission planning. This was reflected in the NARUC comments. And as I said earlier, the urgency is increased since then by the measure of the natural gas price. So it's 8% less urgent than it was at the beginning of the meeting, because that's what gas prices are down today, which is a relief because they've been going up, 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 up. But to me, that drives the urgency. We need cost alternatives. The barriers to cost alternatives need to be knocked down. We've tried and tried and tried on queue reform. There's been multiple queue reforms that hasn't happened, and the need for long-term transmission planning, and that's nexus with the interconnection, is where it's not working. Most of the other areas, it's working, and flexibility is the watchword. But for the stuff that we're talking about today, I don't think the status quo is acceptable, and I think that's reflected in the NARUC comments. Thank you.
And can I just ask, before we go to Commissioner Clement, is there something specific around the cost allocation of interconnection that you think FERC needs to do? Is it clarifying what the guiding principle is? Is it, yeah.
I think guidance is helpful, but at the end of the day, that's a long, hard negotiation. And that's what it is. MISO person, it always calls it the thorny issue of cost allocation. When you reach in there, it's like reaching into a rose bush. I think guidance would be helpful, but at the end of the day, there's an element of negotiation that's just very difficult, that it can't be, I don't think it can be superimposed on parties with different interests. But that's just my view. Thank you.
Commissioner Clements?
Well, I'll say thank you to you all for, thanks. I appreciate your engagement, all of you. I learned a lot from you today, and the level of specificity you brought to the introduction of the issues for discussion is helpful and impressive relative to gaining a shared understanding of where the synergies are in our perspectives, as well as where the tension points are. I think I heard that the majority of you signaled some openness to finding a balance on this issue of participant funding and assigning costs consistent with benefits, at least roughly consistent with benefits, which is what we're required to do, and is also good policy. I think accuracy and simplicity don't always go hand in hand, but that's a good goal. For those of you who continue to be skeptical about some balance of sharing, I'm opening to continue the dialogue, and we have a shared interest in finding something that works for everyone, and that is regionally specific. I hope that you all saw from the commission what we tried to signal, which was allowing that flexibility. You're mentioning, Chair Thomas, to come up with solutions and not immediately stamping out good things that are already happening and don't need to be fixed. Again, I guess this connection between long-term planning and interconnection queues and cost sharing are all essentially integrally intertwined. So that's kind of clear and is helpful as we think about what we're trying to do here. So thanks so much for the engagement.
Great. So now we'd love to hear from all of you, if we could, on your thoughts on what FERC needs to do on these areas and other thoughts. Yeah, Chair Stanek, you were next.
Thank you. It's interesting to see the power of these conversations for the first two task force meetings have partly informed a NOPR, and maybe there's more NOPRs to come. It sounds like there are. To the question on the screen, I know Chair French had an emphatic no. I think the answer, at least from my perspective, is he's probably right, but maybe it's a maybe. Just last week, we heard from PJM stating that they will be filing a proposal with FERC later this month. It was passed out of its committees with overwhelming 80 to 90% stakeholder support. Perhaps it's in their self-interest to get ahead of any federal regulation or rule. But I think we heard here today that regional flexibility remains important, but so does having some at least minimum national baseline, because many of these generators are not just building in PJM or ISO New England, but across the country. And I do really appreciate those comments from Commissioner Clements. I know that the state regulators have been informed by the input and comments of the 4 FERC commissioners today, and we hope to continue these conversations going forward. Thank you.
Chairman LeVar.
Thanks. On the first issue that we discussed in the meeting today, interconnection queue reform, I'd say it's my perspective that many transmission providers in the West are working out potential solutions and are engaging actively to improve the interconnection queue process. So my suggestion, if FERC, since this question is asking what our suggestions would be, if FERC sees a need to prompt maybe the transmission providers who are more reluctant to engage in that reform, I would encourage it to be done in a way that doesn't put up roadblocks for those who are, because I think there's a lot of progress from transmission providers in the West who are trying to get the queue process moving more efficiently with many of the things that were on our agenda today that were discussed. With the second issue, participant funding and that balance, as has been clearly discussed, it's less of an issue in the non-RTO areas of the West. So my only encouragement would be that I hope nothing is developed in that area on the balance between customer load and generator costs that would chill stakeholders in the West's current efforts towards finding more regionalization and hopefully ultimately towards an RTO. I would hate to see the RTO rules that don't currently apply to us evolve in a way that would scare off stakeholders from the work that's happening across the West. Thanks.
Thank you. Chair Nelson?
Yeah, I think when I look at this question specifically, I think there's people in my region working every day to find potential solutions because these things aren't going to fix themselves, right? And so are we going to figure out ways? I think lots of states, lots of regions have. Just being on this task force, I've learned things that other regions have done that I think are innovative and brilliant. So I'm really impressed by the amount of options we have. I do think that given the cost of energy and given what's going on in Europe, that there's going to be a little bit of a tidal wave coming on people looking for alternative solutions, maybe more locally sourced sources of fuel that can have slightly more cost containment. I think New England is particularly exposed at the end of a natural gas pipeline to those kind of price impacts. Couple other notes. I think we were talked earlier about queues and cluster studies. I do think that if we can make sure we have the right safeguards and things in place to make sure the right people are in the queue, there needs to be some release valve in an example where we are going to restudy something, where a different cost allocation application at that position is potentially looked at before we go back down a path of restudy where if you know, marginal projects, again, back to Ted Thomas's idea of metrics, something that's borderline because a few people dropped out, that loss of 9, 12 months to go back to restudy to maybe get to a different result could be better solved through a different cost allocation. And then the last thing I'll say is, you know, and I think this is one thing that's striking me, and I think FERC commissioners obviously have a much better position to view all the different areas. But in a non-vertically integrated RTO, right, we get the benefits of generation being very competitive, but transmission's still a monopoly. And so I think we're always trying to strive to balance to make sure that transmission projects are being constructed to enable a more competitive market. And I think that in instances where we see that those constructions of the transmission line are going to create a more competitive market, that there's some real economic drivers there that I think should be looked at or considered for RTO regions that are not vertically integrated. Thanks.
Thank you. We have Chair Dutrell, then Chair Scripps, then Commissioner Allen.
Thank you. When looking at the question here in front of us in terms of whether challenges and potential solutions are working themselves out, I would generally agree with many of the comments you've heard before you. I think I raised my hand when Chair French was talking about or answering his question. And I do agree that the RTOs are doing a lot of things, as we've seen the different proposals that have been submitted, or in my case, PJM will be submitted soon, but we know that they all know that there's an issue here. And I think many of our conversations and discussions, and you can see from the first half of the meeting that we were in general agreement that there needs to be some changes in terms of queue reform and even talking about regional transmission planning and whether they go hand in hand, but either way, there needs to be some changes there. And so I do think that there are some solutions, whether you want to say they're working themselves out or whether it's through the assistance of just different stakeholders and the RTOs realizing there's a problem there. I believe that solutions are being worked upon. What I think I said in my comments earlier, as some of the suggestions of what can be done or what FERC can do, guidance is important in some of those areas. As I stated out in the first half of the meeting, when I was talking about clustering, it would definitely be, some guidance would be important, but still wrapped around that is just the flexibility of allowing for RTOs to, because they know their regions better than all of us generally. And so allowing that flexibility with them is still important as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair Scripps.
Thanks, Dr. Rob. I really enjoyed the discussion today and have learned a lot, as always, from my colleagues and those on the FERC side as well. Just a couple of, I guess, comments. First, in response to the question on the screen, you know, I think that the core area of focus may be on issues unlikely to be resolved by individual RTOs. And for example, the cross RTO issues like affected system studies that I talked about earlier. That seems to be the place least likely to be worked out on its own, just because of the limits of any one RTO solving that. The second point, I think, is I've heard a lot from different folks that the best path is comprehensive transmission planning, which is likely the most efficient means of addressing many of the issues involved over the long term. I think that has a couple of follow-through points. The first is we should continue to avoid siloing this discussion. And while short-term solutions to queue issues are absolutely needed today, I think there's broad agreement on that. We should seek to avoid adding to silos or creating additional barriers to the optimal long-term solutions. And on that, I agree with Chair LeVar in terms of his comment that we should avoid barriers that make progress towards RTO formation more difficult. And I think the flip side is that where RTOs are in existence, we may want to look at the utilization of whether those RTOs are using long-range transmission planning in thinking about how issues around participant funding are addressed. And it may have the added benefit of encouraging the right long-term solution in terms of that long-range comprehensive transmission planning, if for no other reason than to avoid changes to participant funding if it's truly additive. And then finally, there was a lot of discussion, Commissioner Clements and others, on the temporal issues. And I think it's really important to keep those in mind in this discussion, because whether the additions are part of a planned grid strategy today or not, today's network upgrades or long distance merchant projects are sort of inherently the parts and parcels of tomorrow's grid that serves all users and the common electrical requirements. There are a number of interesting discussions about how to account for changing beneficiaries over time, taking place at MISO and likely elsewhere. And I think that's an important issue to keep in mind as we continue to think about this in a really comprehensive way. So again, I really enjoyed this conversation. My dogs clearly enjoyed the conversation. They're wanting to get in on it as well, and look forward to next steps.
Great. We have Commissioner Allen.
Thanks, Dr. Robb. Make just a few points. First point is just to remind us all, frankly, that we're looking at this at a point in time. We're looking at very significant growth across most regions. I was actually surprised that the relative standing of the Northeast region. I think the growth has not been as dramatic. I am mindful of the fact that on a forward-going basis, that is looking at what we have in front of us, we have and we will expect a lot of growth in our system and many additions, not only to meet the public policy ambitions of my region, but I also believe that one, these are low capacity factor resources. And so there's a lot of gigawatt capacity that would be needed to meet those goals. And frankly, I believe that the global situation today and into the future is going to create additional pressures for what are declining cost resources over time and with respect to the preferred technologies, even today. And over the last 2 years, we've only seen except for a vanishingly small subset of the Q resources, their solar, wind, and their battery technologies. The fossil fuel units are just very, very small within our region. I think that's typical of most of the regions, and certainly on a forward-going basis, I expect that to continue. I do believe that the participant funding queue process is a problem. And I think that's going to continue to be and increase as a problem going forward. I think we need to be thinking in terms of alternatives. I think the planning reforms, the long-term planning reforms that we talked about is, a significant step in a good direction if they can help to address some of the backbone or higher voltage system concerns that relate to the lumpiness of interconnection. Thanks.
Thank you. Commissioner Rechtschaffen.
I'm going to add my voice to what my colleagues have said about and what the FERC commissioners have said about how critical the temporal nature of this discussion is. Reform will take time. Comprehensive transmission planning will take time. It's not a cure-all, by the way, either. It'll be extremely helpful, but it won't be here immediately. And in the meantime, things are changing more rapidly than any of us could ever imagine. The resource mix is changing just because of the market. Our need to meet reliability needs to deal with climate change and extreme events is growing geometrically. We have very rapidly changing state policies, especially in the West, but elsewhere. So there's a lot of things that need to be done right away as we embark on the comprehensive planning effort that we'll need to do. And there's really, I think it's beyond dispute that there's we need queue reform. There's a I don't know if it's a crisis, but there's log jams, dysfunctions, inefficiencies, and a lot of consensus about that. And while we don't all agree on remedies for this particular question of cost allocation, there's certainly very significant concerns about load not properly sharing the benefits that they're getting from these projects, that the network upgrades have broad benefits. And especially if we consider a broader view of benefits, project benefits, as the NOPRs suggests we should do in the regional transmission context. So I think there's a real need to, keep the foot on the gas, and for FERC to provide guidance, templates, best practices, as Chair Stanek said, minimum baselines, while again providing for regional flexibility. That is a very important priority for the jurisdictions in the West, as Commissioner LeVar said.
Well, thank you, everyone, for really your very involved participation all day and your insightful comments all day. I'm going to attempt a very short summary that FERC and NARUC staff and I have been kind of bouncing back and forth a little bit. And then I'm going to hand it over to the co-chairs to each talk a little bit about some of their thoughts, and also to talk about the next steps for the task force and the NOPR process. So first, we start off by talking about that queue backlogs really present an urgent problem, not only causing cost uncertainty, leading to cost increases, but unacceptable timing delays that lead to needed facilities not being built. And there's clearly room for efficiency improvements to expedite the process. We discussed 5 different queue management potential solutions, and I think folks felt that they all had merit and should all be on the table, but allowing for regional flexibility in design and implementation was critical. We also talked about the fact that that queue challenges are symptomatic of a larger problem related to the lack of transmission expansion occurring through reform planning processes, and that increased backbone transmission capacity through a more proactive and holistic planning process should, among other benefits, also address the root cause of some of our challenges related to the interconnection queue. There was a general agreement that regulators need to follow both cost causation principles as well as beneficiary pays law, but many question whether 100% participant funding actually does that. And many argue that also, if it's not appropriate for generators to pay 100%, that it isn't appropriate for load to pay 100% either. And many viewed the proposed cost sharing solutions we explored as trying to get to answers that might be fairer and more consistent with the beneficiary pays laws. It's necessary to remember that there's an important temporal element here too. Currently, there isn't a perfect transmission planning process. So for some of you, participant funding may not be the appropriate approach right now, but could be the right mechanism once again, if the transmission planning investment processes are improved. In the meantime, there needs to be a process to transition between where we are now with very full queues and where we need to be and where we're going. So if a load or the broader system is responsible for paying any portion of the cost of network upgrades, I think many of you said it's really important that those be based on identified benefits that are real and not speculative, and that proposals that are data-driven or have metrics for analysis would be particularly attractive to some. But also some noted that there may be trade-offs between being too precise and the speed of processing the queue and moving each region forward. And finally, as we were just talking about, guidance from FERC on interconnection mitigation and on cost allocation related specifically to interconnection in this case would be very useful. But here again, there needs to be flexibility for each region to have the right fix and the right tools that make sense for them. So with that, I know that we couldn't possibly capture all the nuance of 4 hours of discussion, but hopefully that summary was helpful and is further along than we were by a lot than when we started the meeting. And with that, I want to turn it over to co-chairs for their observations and discussions of next steps.
Thank you, Dr. Rob. And first of all, I want to thank you for another stellar job in moderating our discussions, the second one in a row. And I think we've had some very good dialogue today as well. And again, want to thank the teams of both FERC and NARUC for getting us all prepared and doing all the behind the scenes work that's necessary to get these meetings done. And then wanted to thank again all our FERC colleagues, all our state colleagues for a very good discussion. I want to congratulate Commissioner French for the new addition to his family. And I want to say that I'm disappointed you weren't able to read all the entire NOPR. You definitely have your priorities wrong. We'll have to think about that. But anyway, I just wanted to say, I can only speak for myself, but I believe that there is, in addition to the NOPR that we issued last week, there's additional work to be done on transmission at the FERC level. And I think interconnection reform is certainly up there at the one of the most, from my perspective, one of the highest priority issues we wanted to address. I think the discussion today we had on the reform of the interconnection process, the need to expedite the process, the different options for doing so. There was a lot of consensus on that, and that I very much noted that. I know my colleagues did as well, and I think it would be very helpful as we go forward. I think, as we've seen in the past, the discussions we have here, I think, have significant impacts on the content of how we proceed here at FERC. With regard to participant funding and the issues associated with cost allocating and the costs associated with upgrades, a little less consensus maybe than on the other issue, but that's not surprising given the NARUC comments that were submitted in the ANOPR. There's some state that the comments specifically said some states like the status quo, some states believe there needs to be some reform. So that's something we need to consider as well. I wish, and we're certainly cognizant of all the actions that are going on at the state level, and whatever actions we take at FERC, I think we certainly will, at least from my perspective, hopefully take into account what the states are doing, and certainly not trying to reverse or impede what the progress that the states are making. Not the states, I should say, but also the regions are making, the RTOs are making with regard to interconnection reform and so on. So with that, again, I want to thank everybody for this discussion and look forward to our next meeting, and we'll turn it over to Chair Stanek.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, thanks to Dr. Rob for expert facilitation yet again, and to all the staff that made this meeting possible. About 6 hours ago, I said I'm confident that today's discussion of possible solutions will be productive, and I think they were very productive amongst the 15 members of this task force. I know the N10 has worked hard to prepare. The N10 was hardened to see its comments, its hard work reflected in the most recent NOPR. And I was heartened to see how much in terms of areas of convergence that we reached today. One quote that stuck out to me earlier today was from Chair Nelson, where he stated that being in the queue should mean something, and it should. And we recognize that it really hasn't up until now, and we're dealing with the challenge of fixing the queue problems. But in terms of the second half of the day, we also had some areas of convergence with respect to understanding that the law requires that we follow the legal precedent to allocate costs based on benefits. We had another very healthy discussion today on benefits and making sure that customers who don't benefit from a project don't pay for it. We also didn't hear any disagreement from commissioners with respect to using higher voltage backbone upgrades. in terms of perhaps a proxy, as we've seen done in SPP and in other proposals. So perhaps that's an area to explore further. But I know that the work of this task force is not done. We've tackled some of the more complicated issues, but there are still some that we have yet to tackle. And I know that we're looking forward to meeting yet again at NARUC's annual meeting in July in San Diego. The date is July 20th. And I suspect between now and then, the 15 members of the task force, along with our staff, will get prepared for that NARUC meeting. So on behalf of the state commissioners, thank you to everybody who participated today and for moving this dialogue forward. At this point, Chairman Glick, shall we adjourn the meeting?
Absolutely. With that, this meeting's adjourned. Thank you.
Nice weekend.